Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Summit Series. I'm Paul Andrusyshyn, and I'm a partner in the IBM Payment Center located here in Toronto, Canada. I will be your host for today's webinar, Shaping the Future of Fraud and Real-Time Payments. Now, before we kick off our conversation, on behalf of IBM and Payments Canada, I'd like to thank all of our panel and attendees for taking the time to join us today as we wrap up Fraud Awareness Month on this globally important topic. As is customary for the Summit Series, we'll first start off with a roundtable discussion, and we'll save time at the end to answer your questions. So please use the Ask the Speaker box on the right side of your screen, and we'll try to cover as many as we can. All right, let's introduce our speakers for today. Phillip?
Hi, everybody. I'm Phillip Straley. I'm the president of FNA. For those of you who don't know FNA, we're a London-based analytics software company. We focus on graph analytics and graph AI products for decision automation in 3 areas. So specifically in financial stability for central banks, where we have many central bank clients around the world, liquidity optimization solution for banks and payment system operators, and then anti-financial crime applications, particularly in the consumer scam and fraud space that we're talking about today. Great to be here today.
Thanks, Phillip. Darrell?
Hi, I'm Darrell, and I'm the Director of Fraud here at Payments Canada. At Payments Canada, we're leading the creation of the Real-Time Rail project. As well, I'm leading the creation of fraud services that will be applied to those real-time rail payments, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Darrell. Kate?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Frankish. I'm the former Chief Business Development Officer from Pay.uk, and Pay.uk is the UK's version of Payments Canada. I'm helping Darrell and the team in Payments Canada with some advisory work, looking at their new real-time payment scheme and also the fraud solutions that go alongside that. And last year in Pay.uk, while I was still working there, the last 2 things I delivered were 2 new fraud controls on top of faster payments, which has been around for around 14 years. So really looking forward to today's discussion. Thanks very much.
Okay, and last but not least, Ryan?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I lead fraud strategy at CIBC. Our team protects our clients and our bank against mostly payments and identity fraud. We support all of our Canadian lines of business, not just personal banking, all segments, all channels. I've been involved in payments and fraud-related roles for about 20 years, and this topic is very near and dear to my heart. I've been involved in the payments modernization program since about 2016, so it's great to be here.
Okay, thank you, and thanks, everyone. We've got an all-star cast here for you today. Now, as many of you are aware, RTR is coming very soon here to Canada, and we at IBM are proud to be part of this exciting initiative. Over time, real-time payments will provide a lot of benefits to our economy as a whole and enable faster, more convenient payment options for both businesses and consumers. However, along with seeing a projected boost to GDP, this will at the same time create some new challenges when it comes to fraud risk. And as we have seen with instant and real-time payments globally, the faster a settlement on a rail is, the more that rail becomes targeted by fraudsters, as they are looking to capitalize on the short time frame to settle and the inability to stop payment. It is truly fire and forget. And in today's digital age, payment fraud has become quite sophisticated and the fraudsters are increasingly working together. Now, Darrell, with this as the backdrop, the lead question to you is, what is our industry plan to address fraud when the real-time rail is launched here in Canada?
Yes, thanks, Paul. Yeah, we've assessed the market very much the same way that you just described, that when there was a launch, there was a corresponding increase in fraud. And the driver of that was believed to be, or assumed to be, the faster availability of the funds. Fraudsters love that that fast availability of funds, combined with irrevocability of the payment transactions. So we have lots of good experience from the marketplace to tell us that that's the type of thing that we should expect, is a rise in the inherent level of fraud risk within the marketplace. So the question is, what are we doing about it? So while Canada was not the first to deploy real-time rail payments, UK was one of the early examples, we expect to be one of the first to launch with fraud controls already in place. And we have some good examples of what we expect to be doing with that. And so we'll be doing fraud risk scoring. We'll have risk lists available to that centralize some of that knowledge about prior frauds that have occurred on accounts. We'll have confirmation of payee, and we'll have real-time fraud reporting. So those are some of the central controls that are meant to help augment what existing banks are doing. So Ryan mentioned about controls that help prevent account takeover frauds and that type of thing. This will also build on those and provide some of that knowledge about the risks that exist and are visible from the central network level. So we want to focus on making sure that we've got those central aspects covered and that we're communicating those risks out to the market participants so that they can make a better decision and enhance and reduce the fraud levels overall.
That's great. Thanks, Darrell, for that. So now we've heard that industry perspective. So Ryan, what can we expect to see at the bank level?
Yeah, lots has been going on at the bank level, and it's been happening for a long time, Paul. We're fortunate we've got more than 20 years of digital peer-to-peer payment experience through Interac e-Transfer. We're able to take advantage of seeing what has happened in other jurisdictions, notably the UK after 2008, as well as Australia and the new payments platform in 2018. And we've really focused our efforts on three main capabilities. The first one is strong client authentication, being really sure that it is our client who is making this payment. Advanced real-time analytics, because you can't hold that payment. You have to make a decision right now. Am I letting it go? Am I not letting it go? And lastly, 24/7, 365 security operations. We talk a lot about the real-time part of real-time payments, but I don't know that we spend enough time talking about the always-on component. And you have to be there, operate at pace, operate around the clock when and how your clients want to make payments. And that means looking at your staffing, looking at your operations, and even thinking about, okay, when am I going to do maintenance on my applications? When are we going to do our patching? Because you can't turn off. You can't afford to let your guard down, because that's when you'll be attacked. And it may seem odd, but I think this is a case where we actually benefited a little bit from the experience during the COVID-19 pandemic. Overnight, we were basically thrust into a very different banking and technology world. Many of our clients were suddenly doing digital payments they'd never done before. We had no history for them. We were pressured to raise tap limits, to raise digital payment limits, and we all had to adapt very quickly to use that data to make sure our controls were successful, to make sure that payments were safe, to make sure that our clients were all safe. And the banks, working with Payments Canada, working with Interac and others, all rallied and did that. And I think this time we've got the benefit of a little bit more proactive and collaborative planning, and I'm really excited for how that's setting up.
Okay, that's great. I only hope the telcos could provide as much security as you guys are, because I'm sick and tired of getting these text messages from the CRA telling me that I'm going to go to jail if I don't send $9,000 to this account. But anyways, Kate, you've been through this process in the UK already with the faster payments rollout. So what learnings and recommendations would you like to share with the Canadian payments industry today?
Yeah. So as Darrell mentioned, every jurisdiction that's launched a real-time payment scheme has seen a uptick in fraud. And what's the different types of fraud? Just try, fraudsters are clever. They'll be trying to look at how do they get access to the money, and the speed of money transfer is really where they target. But in the UK, after the initial launch, that calmed down. The real focus was card not present fraud for a while in the UK until 2021. And then in 2021, the authorised push payment fraud, so APP fraud we call it, started to really rise and overtake card fraud in the UK, which was where we got a real focus. And the reason APP fraud happens when a consumer or a business is is basically coerced through social media or through telcos, as you talked about the text that you've been getting, Paul, to send money to somebody that they think is a valid person or business, and then they find out that it's not. And before they can do anything about it, when they report it to their bank, the money's gone. It's gone through a number of other accounts in the chain and been cashed out. So once in 2021, once the UK saw such a significant rise in APP fraud, there was a real focus on what can be done differently. And I think when you look at the different types of APP fraud, there's one that sticks out for me as the most cruel fraud, which is romance fraud. And typically there, somebody online will target a really vulnerable person who's lonely, right? And they'll establish a relationship with that person, and then they'll contact them with once they've built up a relationship over time, with some story about they need money because they need to get out of the country, or they're in danger, something's happening, and really coerce the person to send quite a significant amount of money normally. And then the real cruel part of this is then the victim of fraud feels terrible because they've lost money, but they also feel extremely embarrassed that they feel they've had a relationship and it's not been a relationship at all. So that's one of the most cruel versions of APP fraud. And so the UK focused very much in the last couple of years on a few areas to try and stop that fraud. The first is confirmation of payee, which I know you're launching at the same time as the real-time payments rail in Canada, which is brilliant. And that really helps two things. It helps you make sure you're sending the money to the person you think you are, because there's a name check as well as account number, etc., where the bank that the money's going to. But it also puts a little bit of friction into the journey, and friction for the right reasons is quite important. And then the UK banks put up quite clear messages when you're starting to send money to a new payee that say, are you sure you want to send this? Take a step back, take 5 minutes, and don't do something quickly, fundamentally. So confirmation of payee was expanded to the whole of the UK. So anybody who provides payment services had to sign up to the service. Before then, there was maybe about 50 banks and payment service providers who provided that service. The other part is there was a new regulation brought into the UK. And this is where Canada, you want to get on the front foot so you don't have to deal with this regulation. And Ryan, I'm sure, and the other banks listening today will definitely agree with this, where the APP regulation means today, if you're a UK bank or payment service provider and somebody is a victim of APP fraud, you have to refund them. You've no choice, even if it would be a really high bar, but even if the consumer has done this before and you have warned them not to do it, you will have to pay out up to £85,000 and then share that with the receiving bank. So both banks at either end have a real incentive to tighten both their onboarding financial crime controls and their ongoing fraud real-time kind of controls, so that they're looking at risks, etc., and they're managing to stop payments where they see a potential fraud. So I think there's lots to learn from the UK and things to do, what you're doing through Payments Canada, putting in those controls up front and allowing the banks and payment services providers to make those decisions with really good data in an informed way might stop some of the fraud that we saw in the UK. But again, we can't be naive to think that fraudsters won't find new ways. So it's about also being prepared as a payments community in Canada to look at, continually look forward and make change as and when necessary.
Yeah, that's great. And those are some really good insights there. Okay, so let's shift over to Phillip. So given your company's role in deploying fraud solutions at both the industry and the bank level, what have you learned throughout your technological implementations from these other jurisdictions?
Right. Great question, Paul. So I guess first it's maybe useful just to set out kind of what our vantage point is. So we're principally focused on APP fraud, so authorized push fraud, which was just mentioned, and exclusively focused on analytics technology. I think the first thing to understand is that there's an enormously wide technology landscape out there. Ryan mentioned earlier scoring models, that have been in place for instant payments for a long time. Fraud scoring models have been in place in banks for decades, for various types of applications. So these are nothing new. What is new, and what I think is really the kind of where we see the industry going to, and where we see many jurisdictions going to, is adopting national level, industry-wide shared infrastructures. I think, frankly, it's fantastic what Payments Canada and Interac, et cetera, are doing. They're the only jurisdiction that I'm aware of that's kind of tried to use a Canadian term, tried to skate to where the puck is going to be, in a sense, and get at least the core technology infrastructure on a shared basis into place before RTR goes live. Most have done it the opposite way, that we've seen, but we are seeing a really, I think, a groundswell of countries around the world that are trying to get in front of this and that are taking industry-wide approaches. So I think that's the first thing. Individual banks obviously have privileged information about their customers' behaviors, et cetera, both in terms of payments and other aspects, privileged information in terms of demographics of their customers, but they don't have a bird's eye view around transactions in an overall payments network. They don't have detailed information around payee, et cetera. And those are the types of things that can come from shared national infrastructures. I think the second thing that we've seen as a real learning, Paul, is that it's critical to have a clear multi-year roadmap with very clear owners around who's going to be responsible for building the shared infrastructure, operating the shared infrastructure, overseeing the overall anti-scam initiatives. I think this is something, again, that Canada is doing very well right now. Our experience is, and we're actually only halfway through it in a few countries. We're not all the way through it in any country, because I think every country is on a journey. These are probably 4 or 5 year deployments for national infrastructures, and so having a clear view around what the priorities are is very important. Who the key owners and stakeholders are. The third point that I'd raise is that I think that it is very important that there's focus on both what we call pre-settlement and post-settlement components, meaning controls put in place before a payment is made, like verification of payee, like network level graph AI models that can score transactions in real time, sub-second response times at the same time that verification of payee is done, and deploy those out to CIBC or other banks with full information around the entire payments network. So that's what we call pre-settlement. But I think the post-settlement components around once there has been a reported scam, there can be huge advantages gained by automated case management applications, real-time track and trace, so you have an understanding across rails, so across your instant payment system and your QR payment system, across ATM data, feeding into crypto, et cetera, real-time understanding where that money is, so that you have a shared up view between the banks, the payment service providers, law enforcement, the FIU, et cetera. These can bring real benefits if you look at both pre and post-settlement components. I'll stop there. I could go on, but maybe we come back to Q&A.
Okay.
Cool.
Thanks, Phillip. You've raised some really good points there, and I think we're starting to hear kind of a common theme throughout, all of the points raised already today. So it's good to see that, a lot of the learnings that you guys are sharing back with us here are already pieces that, Payments Canada and at the bank level have already started to take into account. So, that's really good news and very positive. Ryan, over to you. So what technological advancements are you kind of seeing and are you getting excited about in the fraud space?
Yeah, great question. There's lots to be excited about. And, I think we first have to acknowledge how far we've come. Like, the security posture now versus 2008 is a completely different world. You could argue even 5 years ago is a completely different world. we were using mother's maiden name for authentication on some services. We had very little multi-factor authentication. Today we've got biometrics, we've got behavioral biometrics, we've got FIDO2 solutions. But even then, this is always going to be a race. We know the tools out there are used by the fraudsters. We know they're going to adapt their tactics, and we need to keep moving. But some of the points that we've called out on real-time rail that present some of the risks also present some of the advantages we have on the defense side. And Phillip and Darrell both got into this a little bit. Like, contrast it to a check. There's very little context. There's very little data that you can use. With a real-time payment, I can go out and ping the network, ping the beneficiary bank. We can pull our data together. We can make sense out of that data with some of the new AI and analytical tools that are out there to put together a more fulsome picture, make a better decision. That can be tough to do with legacy tools, but some of these new AI tools, these new Gen AI tools, are making that a lot easier, making it a lot easier to make sense out of that data, identify trends more quickly, respond with new strategies, countermeasures, and the like. But like I said earlier, we have to accept that while we have the tools, so do the fraudsters. They're well-funded, they're well-organized. It's not 17-year-old hackers in a basement, I like to say. It's state actors, it's organized crime and the like. They're investing in these tools, and they don't have nearly the same respect for data residency and privacy law and all those other important considerations that we need to navigate. So the tools are helpful, but really this is why it's so important to have sort of a team approach to this with collaboration across the banks, the payment networks, Payments Canada, the telcos, as you called out earlier as well.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. And as we've heard here, there's so many new anti-fraud solutions launching every day, it feels like. And whether it's because of the marketing hype around AI, or it's VCs wanting to pump it in terms of trying to boost valuations, right? Every single solution nowadays is saying it's AI enabled. There is Gen AI, and there seems to be a tremendous amount of hype there. And so maybe Darrell, question for you is, do we believe that AI is really going to be the game changer here for our industry as everyone is promoting? And do we feel that it's going to help tip the scales in our favor?
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's a sword that cuts both ways. It can be used against you on offense, but we're focused on the defensive side. Definitely being able to gather different streams of information, put that information together, piece it together, and make an advisement on the risk level of that transaction, and whether it makes sense not just for that customer, but does it make sense for that payee? Does it make sense for what else you're seeing in the network? So individual banks are not going to be able to be aware of all the different things that are happening off of their bank's sort of property, if you will. They're not aware of what's happening at a different bank, that 3 other payments that kind of match the similar criterion have already occurred, and one of them has a dispute against it. So you can quickly digest that and get that into a score that can help inform things and bring that intelligence forward. That's the type of thing that we are building to help us. And AI is one of the tools that helps digest that information rapidly and get it into a digestible form to communicate back.
Okay, maybe a direct question just on that one. There's a lot of talk around AI replacing humans, right? And in this case, where there is something flagged and it is raised, do we still see the humans getting involved, or do we see AI starting to kind of take over and take on some of that decisioning?
Well, a lot of the information that's being gathered and assessed is happening in the sub-second level. So there's not really a chance for a human to gather all that information and come to a conclusion. So that decisioning aspect is very much focused on the technologies to get to that sub-second time frame. All of the discussions and things that you do after that decision, that's where the humans come involved. On the fraud operations side, reaching out to that customer that's had a declined transaction and talking to them, trying to talk them off the ledge if the belief is that they're involved in a scam or an authorized push payment fraud. or remediating their account if it looks more like an account takeover. So that's where the judgment and the humans will always be involved on the bank side and that type of thing for customers and making sure it's more the customer remediation where the humans get engaged and establishing that trust back with the account. Because that's one of the things that humans do much better than machines. So we'll be continuing to use humans in here, but the machines have a big role in it too.
Okay, and Ryan, do you have anything further to add to that one from a bank perspective?
Yeah, just echoing what Darrell said, like you got to have the right tool in the right place. And these big data tools performing the real-time monitoring are a critical piece of our monitoring approach. But at the end of the day, this is a person trying to make this payment, and particularly if they are potentially falling victim to one of these authorized push payment scams like Kate was covering earlier, you kind of need to break the spell, and having them interact with something automated, rules-driven, a workflow, very anonymized, very impersonal, can be difficult to break through, find the triggers, make a connection, establish trust, and kind of help the person break out of the fog that they might be in if they've fallen victim to a scam. Even then, AI can help them by listening in on that conversation, providing tips, assisting workflow, but we definitely think our people are a very key part of the solution here.
Okay. Thank you. So jobs are safe is what we're basically saying, right?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so Kate, I mean, again, kind of going back to the UK and your expertise in this area, have you seen success in utilizing these new tools?
Yeah, so we actually did a proof of concept last year to do exactly what Canada is trying to do, to prove. So at that point, we didn't have data sharing, so we couldn't use all of the data that runs through faster payments. And I think Phillip talked about, each bank has their own little slither. They can see their transactions, they can monitor them, they can understand unusual behavior. But that's not anywhere near as powerful as understanding all of the transactions that are flowing through the country from a real-time perspective. You see much more movement, the systems can understand and use AI to drive much more targeted decisions. So our proof of concept was based on sharing 13 months of previous data with 3 technology suppliers. And we asked them to let their systems, their AI tools, learn from that 13 months of data and then give decision flags back to the banks involved to say, we would, these are the high levels of potential fraud that we would have flagged to you during that time. The banks then matched that against their real fraud flags, so what had been actual fraud during that period of time. And the results were significant, as we expected them to be, right? It was a 40% uplift in detection rates, so 40% more of fraud was detected at a lower, what you call a false positive rate. So false positives are how many real payments do you interrupt to get one fraudulent payment, and normally in the UK that's about 20 to 25 payments for one fraud. Now this was at a 5 to 1 false positive ratio, so only 5 payments being interrupted. So that's great because you're not putting in friction to real payments. People are allowed to make real payments and they go ahead, or there's less friction. And also there's less operational costs for the banks involved because they don't have to speak to and do as much remediation with those cases. So it was a really good proof of concept. We also used card data for one of the banks agreed for their debit card data to be used as well, and that provided a further 30% uplift in detection rates. So there's something in there about combining data from different payment schemes as well, which gives a better result. So that piece of work proved that data sharing and using the central data was really important, and the UK are now, my old team are actually working on making that an actual production version in the centre. But it took that proof of concept to prove to the UK banks that they could trust a centralized solution. I think in Canada, you've turned it on its head. You're doing that before you launch, which is a great thing to do because you won't have all of the unpicking that we had to do in the UK. But fundamentally, the answer is AI, as Darrell said, used in the right way is really, really powerful. And because real-time payments are real-time, you need something that's going to give decisions very quickly to the bank so that teams like Ryan's area, Ryan's company can make decisions on behalf of their customers, whether they make that payment or stop it.
Thank you, Kate. I fully agree. I mean, couldn't have said it any better. I mean, it's great to see that, it's not just talk, it's not just, noise in the industry and customer product companies, over promoting their products. It's great to see this actually working and live and real implementations coming forward. And I'm sure we're going to start to see this stuff coming in Canada as well as we move forward. Okay, so let's shift gears for a second. Let's talk about collaboration and what we can do as an industry here in Canada to work together. I mean, we know the bad guys work together. I mean, and it's time we collaborate more closely to start to combat, fraud, especially in real time. And when I get all these phone calls, I'm sure as many people do, you get these spam phone calls, and you pick up, you listen to it, and it's almost like somebody is calling you from a call center. You can hear it all going behind the scenes. And in my mind, I picture those scenes from The Beekeeper, right? For those of you who have seen that movie, and that's really the level of sophistication that I think we're starting to deal with here. So around this topic, I mean, how are each of your organizations collaborating internally and externally to achieve better outcomes for everyone? And maybe Kate, we'll go back to you and start there.
Yeah, I think collaboration is key here. One of the things that I always used to talk to the UK banks that I dealt with about was, fraud shouldn't be a competitive game. It should be something that you all collaborate with to make sure the strength against the fraudsters, who are, as we've talked about, are highly organised, very well funded, and move at pace. One example in the UK, actually, the UK insurance industry about 10 years ago agreed to collaborate on data sharing, and they've managed to really reduce insurance fraud. So sharing claims data with each other over a digital database allows them at the point of application to stop somebody from being able to, have frauds against many insurance companies in the UK. So there's proven models of collaboration out there. The other thing I would talk to as well is it's not just the banks. You've got to get the telcos and you've got to get the big tech companies to come to the table, because that's where the fraud starts. 76% of APP fraud in the UK starts online, and 17% starts on telcos. So if you don't get them to have a bit of skin in the game and help with the problem solving, Payments Canada is at the end of the chain. The banks are just in front of Payments Canada. There's plenty of time and space before then where there are signals and data to be used to stop the fraud in the first place. So that wider collaboration, I think, if you can get your regulators and government to think about pushing these companies to get involved, that's something that's really would be significantly impactful.
Okay, thank you. Phillip, from your perspective?
Yeah, maybe I'll just give two examples, two kind of real world examples. So one, industry collaboration example, and the other, a kind of tech world or tech industry collaboration example. I mentioned earlier in my comments about post-settlement solutions or post-settlement technologies. One of the things that we've seen, in many of the jurisdictions, or in most, frankly, all of the jurisdictions that we've been involved in to date, is, after faster payments have come in, there's been an enormous increase in APP fraud, anywhere from 50 to 100% a year for many years running. Kate talked to some of this already. I think a very positive example where a country, in this case, Malaysia. So Malaysia was the first country to put in place a real-time track and trace capability at an industry-wide level that is used intraday in real time once a case has been validated of a scam. And what collaboration there, and here we're talking collaboration between banks, e-wallet providers, the central bank, which is operating the anti-scam center, and other stakeholders, particularly national law enforcement. they have brought, after this capability has been put in place, which was about a 15 to 18 month process, they brought clawback rates of scammed money on average from half of 1% up to a bit over 30%. And for early reported cases, close to 100%. So this is real money that's going back to scam victims. So I think that's a fantastic example. And there are other countries, many countries. I know that, the UK has been working out data sharing rules, et cetera, has had in place a track and trace capability, but because of data sharing limitations, haven't been able to have it in place in real time to the industry intraday. I think a lot of countries, including the UK, are now moving beyond that, and I think it's something that's very important. And then the second, in terms of a tech industry collaboration example, I'll keep very brief, by just saying that, this is a very, very big universe. And, in terms of technology enablement for anti-scams and fraud, no one vendor, no one tech player is going to dominate this space. It's just way too broad. Too many capabilities need to be brought to bear. But if I just use a couple of personal examples where we're involved, in Malaysia, for instance, and another example where it's our technology that has been used for the real-time track and trace capability. However, the central fraud registry and the case management applications have been built by the national payment system operator, by PayNet, which is the Payments Canada equivalent in Malaysia. And we have to interoperate with that technology. There are actually kind of feedback loops both directions, actually, between those technologies. The same is true if you have scoring applications. So you get, many good signals from a real-time track and trace capability that can feed back into the scoring models. And going forward, we may not be providing the scoring models, for instance. So I think that's another example where, we need to take a whole society approach, and even tech vendors that are competing with each other, are going to collaborate very closely if we're going to solve the problems or get closer to it.
Okay. Thanks, Phillip. And Darrell, maybe I'll turn over to you just to kind of finish off this question.
Yeah, and I'll take it down to what we're doing for sort of release 1, right? So collaboration is key, and being at the center of the network is really a privilege. And so what is Payments Canada doing with that privilege? We're developing 3 capabilities that kind of interoperate. I've mentioned them before. The risk list, that gives, where you have a confirmed fraud, what intel can you gain to help prevent additional losses on that account, and you realize some system-wide or ecosystem-level benefits of fraud prevention by getting out better scores. So that's the second capability. Taking advantage of that information and intelligence that you've gathered, looking at the behaviors that are occurring even preceding a fraud report. You may be able to predict and look at some of those behaviors and say, that's unusual, anomalous behavior, and we've seen prior frauds that look just like that one. And looking at the network of individuals that that person is paying preceding that. The final one is confirmation of payee, and that one requires system-wide collaboration on being able to exchange and say, hey, is this Paul's account or is this not Paul's account? And getting an answer back that says yes or no, or you're kind of close, but maybe you misspelled it. So there's various levels that we're establishing that interoperability. Payments Canada is kind of more focused on just the pre-transaction level for where that collaboration is. And we're, in effect, the clearinghouse of that intelligence exchange.
Okay, thank you. And we'll open up the floor to the audience Q&A in a moment. So again, for those listening in, please start submitting your questions in the Ask the Speaker box. And as it is Fraud Prevention Month and we're coming to the close, we'd like to leave everyone with a practical takeaway. So, from each of you, what is one thing everyone can start doing today to prevent fraud? And Darrell, we'll go back to you. Start.
I've got sort of a three-step plan, which is screen your calls. Unless you have a really strong need for getting your dirty ducks clean and have $100 to spare, don't answer that phone. It's not who you think it is. The second is if you get an unexpected call and it's got an urgent request for action, you got to take 5. There's a whole campaign in the UK about it, but taking 5 minutes to think about it, and especially get off the phone to think about it, because they're going to, the scammers and fraudsters are going to be pummeling you with questions and new information to try and distract you and get you to stop thinking about things in the moment. The third part is have a plan. Getting off the phone is one step. Checking with a trusted person is a second step that I think is really valuable. The third part of that sort of have a plan is be someone else's trusted person. Be able to talk to them, say, hey, is this a reasonable request? Are there things that I could do to verify this once I'm off the phone? If it's a threat to your account, go log in, right? See what it is. Call the number on the back of your card. So that's the 3-step process. Number 1, prevent, screen the calls. Number 2, take a moment. Number 3 is have a plan to get off the phone and verify things.
Thanks, Darrell. Kate?
Yeah, adding to what Darrell says, also be careful about who you accept LinkedIn requests from, because social media and LinkedIn are all areas where fraudsters use as a ground to understand, okay, what's your role and how do you work in this company? And therefore, if I send an email, if you're in finance, if I send an email from your CEO looking like, can you send this money? You'll send the money quickly because you're worrying because it's from your CEO. So be really careful and screen who you link in with. I think that's part of the jigsaw as well.
Okay, Phillip?
Yeah, maybe I'll go a little bit different direction. I agree with everything that Darrell and Kate said, in terms of individuals preventing fraud. I think that, if we look at, the industry as a whole, beyond what I said around kind of putting in shared infrastructures, which I think is critical, I truly believe that particularly with APP fraud that, despite the fact that everybody wants to have true instantaneous payments and and individuals want to have convenience, that I think that the industries in each country and increasingly cross borders will need to collaborate on putting in place speed bumps that make sense, and they need to be put in place across the industry, to try to curtail some of the APP fraud. If it's done just in one institution or 2 institutions, obviously you then have competitive problems and you get complaints on customer service. But I think implementing speed bumps, delays on payments, et cetera, is going to be necessary, absolutely required if we're going to get in front of this.
Thank you. Ryan?
Yeah, I actually want to take it in a different direction. I'd say please talk about fraud. Your family, your friends, your neighbors. I know we don't just say, hey, did you hear about that scam the other day? But these types of things are real. They happen here. We need to be more aware of them. The education and knowing that it's out there is the single best defense that we have. And that ties into some of the things that Darrell said. It doesn't just happen to seniors. It doesn't just happen to non-tech savvy people. The most targeted group is Gen Z, often because they've lived their whole life online. So my appeal would be talk about it. And then what do you talk about in that message? Well, a lot of what the others have said, slow down, take a breath, take 5. I love that. Take 5, read this. Does it make sense? And if you're unsure, just stop, call somebody you trust, verify the source. If it's your bank, if it's the CRA, if it's law enforcement, hang up and call at known, good, trusted numbers. Like we've heard great reporting of terrible stories from the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre about scams, about fraud losses, and how much goes unreported because people are embarrassed, ashamed. They just don't like talking about fraud. Sure, we want to report more, but better, I'd rather people take that moment of pause, call somebody they trust, and have that bit of an intervention before they actually send the payment and click on the link. And I think there's huge opportunity there that has no dollar cost for us to do.
Okay, thanks for that. That's a lot of great insight there. And just in the terms of sharing, I will personally tell you guys that, I call myself a self-declared fraud expert, not because I've worked in financial services since 1998, not because, every project I've done has had some aspect of fraud in it. It's actually because I've been defrauded so many times, right? So from credit card skimming to, buying goods online and the goods never showing up. And then the most recent one actually is, and this isn't fraud, but it was a hack. There's a data breach at the Canadian Hockey Coaches Association, right? So 60% of my PII data is now sitting out there, thanks to me being a hockey coach, right? So at the end of the day, they're targeting so many different angles now. It's really hard to keep pace. So again, thanks everyone for that. So we were going to get to the questions now, and starting off, Phillip. What was your biggest technology learning from other jurisdictions who have launched real-time payment systems?
Okay, thanks, Paul. I think I've actually already hit probably most of them, but maybe I'll recap and add a little bit. So I mean, I think the first is, as I've said already a couple of times, centralized shared infrastructure is absolutely critical. No financial institution can do it on their own. They'll be much better off with collaboration, not just physical collaboration, but also technology infrastructure that enables it. Second, and I already said this, but I'll say it in a slightly different way. I think that going for best of breed technology providers or best of breed technology vendors for each component is the way forward. With modern technology integration techniques, via APIs, et cetera. It's pretty easy to link them up. Any vendor that can't integrate that way, with other vendors, probably shouldn't be considered. So I think, that's the second point that I'd make. And then the third is, I think that every country is different. The pain points are different, and so country-specific prioritization is very important. I mean, we see Payments Canada and Interact and the Canadian ecosystem prioritizing in one way versus Singapore versus the UK versus the UAE. And I think that's right. I think that there are learnings across countries, but the reality is that the dynamics in each country are different.
Okay, and here's just another quick question for you. How do we weed out false positives with limited access to automated tools and rules? Do you have any recommended approaches there?
I mean, I would say that, my first reaction is that you probably can't. I mean, rooting out, with any model, first you require good data. In this case, as Kate was talking about with the UK experience, which we were, in full disclosure, we were not involved in the UK case. It requires, a significant amount of historical data if you're going to have a meaningful model in terms of precision or management of false positives. And then, in the real-time space, the reality is that you need real-time instantaneous feedback. So one thing is building a good model, and that's very, very important. The second is having a delivery mechanism that is probably 10 or 20 or 30 milliseconds. And so I don't see how you do it without automation. If you need to be delivering this at the same time effectively as verification of payee well sub-second, I don't think you can do it.
Okay, thank you. Got a couple questions here for Ryan, so let's start with the first one. Email takeover is increasingly common. Do you see phone numbers and other authentication apps being mandated for multi-factor authentication to reduce fraud?
Yeah, for sure. But it's interesting, right? Like I mentioned earlier how we all used to use mother's maiden name, or, what was the name of our first pet? Then we moved to stronger passwords. We moved to email, multi-factor. Now we've got a whole bunch of other factors. Our bank doesn't believe in email as a strong security solution. We've moved away from that a couple of years ago. We still use SMS and phone as well as push notifications, much more secure, and moving more towards biometric and other solutions. But I guess the key point here is there is no finish line. As we've seen in other jurisdictions and even here in Canada, as you introduce new things that are the latest, greatest, most trusted, fraudsters adapt their tactics and find ways to exploit those. They may call a client pretending to be law enforcement or the bank and needing that code, social engineering that code away to be able to obtain access. So this is going to be an endless game of improve, improve, improve. And we know the fraudsters don't stop. But certainly if you're using email for authentication, get away from that ASAP.
Okay. And then the next question to you is, what is high on CIBC's agenda when it comes to fraud mitigation and prevention as fraud schemes continue to evolve?
Yeah, there's a lot of different pieces that need to come together. And we've heard a bunch of them throughout Darrell, Phillip, and Kate's comments today, right? Like, starts with education so clients can protect themselves, they can bank safely, they can spot and self-select out of some of the common scams we've talked about. You need strong authentication tools, not email, to validate your identity. Be sure that it's actually our client, interacting in our channels, whether that's digital banking centers, contact centers. And we've done a lot of great work over the last several years to really upgrade those capabilities. And then the big piece, which is probably where more of the work will go over the next couple of years, is all these capabilities with AI-powered real-time transaction monitoring. How do we make sense out of the data that we have about our clients, Interact and Payments Canada, some of our other partners have about beneficiaries, the payee, and other data that's out there that could be risk signals. How do we take all of that? And we've done a lot of work to upgrade our transaction monitoring over the last, I would say, 8 years in particular. And in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of work focused on those AI-based capabilities. And I think that's really where we're going to continue to focus.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. To this question, I mean, again, I'll go back to Phillip, from your company's objectives, right? And everything that you're doing in this space, what are you guys kind of looking at next on your roadmap?
Okay. So maybe I first should describe kind of what we have now, and then I could talk about our roadmap. So we have a product or a set of products that we call the National Fraud Portal, and effectively you could think of it like a number of enablers that are common across applications. So that's a centralized fraud database, centralized caching of instant payments transactions, caching of other relevant data, for instance, ATM, crypto data, et cetera. So you can think of it like a centralized fraud database, let's call it for lack of a better term. Also shared connectors across the various applications. And then, as I said, also aspects where you've got feedback loops between applications. So for instance, AI-driven scores that will pass from one application to another. And then we've already built 3 live applications, one for case management, one for real-time track and trace, which I mentioned earlier that we call Money Trails. And then the third for transaction and account scoring using Graph AI models. And Graph AI is a fancy term that means effectively, instead of, for instance, behavioral or demographic factors in your models, we're using network or graph features of data. So what community is a payer or a payee in? What is the network distance between the payer and payee? These types of graph features, and then build models on top of those. There are other applications that we're working on, for instance, for supervisory reporting. Would be another example. But then there are many other applications that we would see interoperating with what we provide, and maybe even using the same central fraud database that we provide for things like verification of payee, things like kind of automated surveillance of the threat landscape, crypto applications, et cetera, which we don't have any intention to develop ourselves, but which I think are part of the whole picture, and we need to be able to work with them.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Kate, over to you. How do you balance customer experience with protecting end users in real time?
Yeah, I suppose in the UK we had a real we thought that was going to be a bigger problem than it was when some of the new regulations were brought in. So there are a few things, Philip talked about putting some bumps in the road. So the regulation meant that all banks and payment providers had to put warnings in front of a new payment. So, it's actually quite simple. It's a couple of questions when you're setting up a new payee that allow you to take a step back and think, am I sending money to the right person? And you might need to do a biometric. With my bank, I still have to do hold the phone up to my face to do a biometric check for a new payee, as well as confirmation of pay, etc. So you would think that would be annoying and it would be too much friction, but it's not, and you get used to it. And actually, the feedback that the UK banks have had from their customers has been they quite like that level of friction because they know it's there to protect them. So as long as it's implemented well, it's within the digital journey, and it helps consumers take a step back and think. I think there has to be some friction, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the detriment of the actual consumer journey.
Okay, thank you. Darrell, over to you for any kind of last final thoughts before we close.
Sure thing. Thanks, Paul. And thanks to all the participants here, Phillip, Kate, and Ryan. Been very instructive and informative. I think the thing that we think of is, we've got things that we're targeting to do for release 1, and those are specific capabilities and technologies that we're applying to make sure that we're sort of leading the fraud controls forward, to make sure that we've got an appropriate set of controls that help mitigate the inherent fraud risk. That's where we started off the discussion, is seeing that the things, there were increased pressures at launch. We've got some controls in place. In that respect, in a comparative manner, we think that we're in a better position than some of the other markets that launched without them. That doesn't mean that the journey ends at release 1, though. And so we've got other things that Phillip's highlighted about, being able to track, trace, and impound some of the funds to make sure that you can get that money back at a later time. Those are things that are very attractive to us because it denies fraudsters value, which ultimately contributes to reducing demand. Those are things that we're contemplating and considering for future releases. And as Payments Canada operating the national infrastructure, we are interested in bringing those capabilities to market. Those are things that we will be looking to do. There are other technologies have been mentioned as well, and we'll be doing some of the prioritization over the next year or so to get ready for the next generation of controls. In terms of the Fraud Prevention Month, key themes are, take that moment. Don't feel guilty about screening your calls. Make sure you've got good password hygiene and that type of thing, not using the same password on your email as what you've got on your bank account and that type of thing. But the biggest thing is take that step back and think before you act. Because that's probably the thing that will save you from some of these actions in the long run. We've all got to learn to trust our instincts, and if it feels too good to be true or too worrisome to be true, then you should do some additional work and validate those things. So those are the key things to help keep yourself safe. Those are also the things that we're thinking about as we deploy these new capabilities into market, and how we can all cooperate is the other element to make sure that we're getting that intelligence shared and everyone benefits within the ecosystem.
Okay, thank you so much. And I just realized I didn't share my insights and my recommendation on top of all the other great recommendations that are there is check your credit score on a regular basis. There's free tools available within your bank. You should be able to access it through online. Go in and check your credit score and make sure that there's nothing there that's been happening behind the scenes without your knowledge. Okay, so thank you so much to our panel today for sharing your expertise with us. It's been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation with all of you. We look forward to continuing the discussion on the future of payments at the 2025 Summit taking place May 6th to 8th at the Beanfield Center in Toronto. Hope to see you guys there. Please stop by the IBM booth, say hi. And for those who can join us in person, Payments Canada is happy to provide all participants today with a promo code to save on your registration. And for those of you who can't make it to Toronto, Payments Canada is also offering a digital experience ticket, and we encourage you to join us all virtually. Thanks again, everyone, for your time and your interest. Have a great rest of the day. Bye for now.